the United States, Great Britain, came to be what they are today. It all started, we can say, in the Bible back at the time of the covenants given to Abraham. And the first covenant was in Genesis 13:14. And the second covenant in Genesis 22:16 was an unconditional one, in which the seed of Abraham, or his descendants, would be unconditionally covenanted by God. They went into idolatry or whatever they would do, that he would unconditionally watch over them. And so out of this came Isaac and Rebekah, and of those two came Jacob and Esau. He came the progenitor of these 12 tribes of Israel. Of those was Rachel, Jacob's wife, and of those two was Joseph and Benjamin, the two sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. There's also the tribe of Judah and Tamar having the affair in which Pharez and Zerah was produced, and the lines that came down to Israel came from these lines of Pharez and Zerah. In the biblical story, when Jacob was about to be deceased in his old age, he adopted the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim, the youngest, and Manasseh, the eldest. And so when Joseph brought the two sons in, and he placed the eldest on the right side and the youngest on the left side. And when Jacob gave the blessing to these people, he crossed his hands. And Joseph said, No, my father, you have to give the blessing to the eldest. And Jacob said, No, my son, I know what I'm doing. And so we have the tribes of Israel coming out of Egypt. We have them coming into the promised land. And we know that David ruled over Israel around 1000 B.C. and that Solomon, his son, was the one who inherited the kingdom. And so he went on, I believe, for 40 years. And we understand from history that Solomon's navy went all over the world to bring back the trade from not only North America and South America, but in the Far East to India, what we would call the Far East. And so we have here in the United States living stones. We also have a tribe of Indians that have a fall festival almost in line with the Israeli Feast of Tabernacles. There's also a stone in, I believe it's Arizona, has the Ten Commandments on it. So where did these stones come from? Who put the Ten Commandments on the stone? And how did they get here? Well, they got here by ships. And we know from history that Solomon's had a huge fleet of ships. And then after Solomon's reign, because of idolatry, the 10 northern tribes were separated from Judah and Benjamin and the Levi. And we understand from history that because of their idolatry, Gentile nations were allowed to come in and carry them away captive. Also, in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, verse 18, these two chapters are called the blessings and cursings chapters. And it says to the children of Israel, if you will obey my laws and my ordinances, I will bless you. But if you don't, these curses will come upon you. And one of the things that came upon them, or was to come upon them, in Leviticus 26:18, that there would be 7 times 7, or 2,520 years, that Israel would be cursed, for there would be no blessings coming to them. And so, as we understand, the Gentile nations came in, Assyria, Babylonian system, and carried them away captive. And so the children of Israel were scattered over Europe and over the Middle East. And so how do we know that? Well, the reason we know that is because as they moved across these lands, they left their fingerprints, so to speak. For instance, the tribe of Dan left the Dniester and the Danaan. When you get over into the British Isles, it's London, D-O-N, and all these things have a fingerprint of the tribes of what they call the lost tribes of Israel. And so the two sons Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, were having the covenant blessing of Israel placed upon them. And in these blessings, and in the giving of Israel, that Israel would have the blessings of God, and that they would control the sea gates of their enemies, that they would be industrious, and that they would grow high in the nations, or high over the Gentile nations, and be rulers in the world. And so out of this thousands of years of history, we come down to the latter days of the 6,000 years. Well, the 2,520 years of the curses on Israel ended in the year 1800. And we can say, why is that significant? Well, the significance is that the United States and Great Britain became great, I guess you could say. And you can see how things were leading up. That 400 years ago, around the early 1600s, there was a colony of England in Virginia. We know about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. We know about the many trips that came out of the Netherlands. We also know that the reason for some of these things, or some of the migration, was because of religious persecution. So we know that there was 13 colonies, and guess what? There was 12 tribes of Israel, and the half-tribe of Manasseh made 13. So the reason for, this is historical, but for the reason that in the late 1700s, that this nation won its independence, or went for its independence, was because the 2,520 years weren't up yet, and that the independence in 1776 of the United States, you might say, was basically preparing the way for the Israelitish nation of the United States and Great Britain to come into their prominence as world leaders. And the things that happened, one of the things that happened to make such a great transition was that because of the wars in Europe, that Spain sold the Louisiana Purchase, or New Orleans, to the French. And because of the European wars and France needing a cash flow, or financially depleted, when the president, I believe it was Jefferson, sent emissaries over to France to get New Orleans, to keep the British out of New Orleans, because you see there was still this animosity because of the War of Independence. And so when they got over there, above all things, France gave them, or sold them, the Louisiana Purchase, what's called the Louisiana Purchase, which I think was around 800,000 acres for $15 million. Now, I don't know who put the bill for that mortgage, but anyhow, that was in 1803, April 1803, that the Louisiana Purchase was transacted, exactly in the time frame of the lifting of the curses of the 2,520 years. And so the United States got a big chunk of property, expanding its borders, and also that the United States has some of the most fertile ground, and in southern Canada, the prairie where they grow wheat is some of the most fertile ground in the world. And you might ask, well, why do we know this? Why do we understand this? The reason we can understand it is because in 1 Corinthians 2:14, these things are spiritually discerned. In other words, the Bible has a history, a world history. So if you can spiritually discern what happened to the Israelitish nations and where they are today, you have an insight on world history and where we're going. The United States and Great Britain basically populated by immigrants. As I said before, a lot of them were religiously persecuted. And there's a huge history about the independence of the United States in the 1700s, and we have to realize, too, that 1700 is a long time ago, and all the men and women in the independence movement were born in the early 1700s. And also, things were pretty impoverished then. There wasn't any cell phones, there wasn't any radio. It was all done by ship, and documents were written down and passed hand by hand, or better yet, maybe transported by horseback. So as far, even today, I can remember in the 1940s, here in rural Adams County, there wasn't any electricity other than our farm. And the reason electricity was here is because my father had milk to refrigerate, and we had an electric motor. So things was pretty primitive in the United States up until the latter part of the 20th century. And of course, in the United States, we had the Civil War. We also had a financial crisis. We also had problems with the Mexican border. We had the Spanish-American War of 1898. And so our country went through a terrible time of trial and test. One of the reasons we have the laws that we have and the freedoms we have is because in Britain, the common laws were founded on, or based on the laws of God, or the Ten Commandments based. Also in 1611, here we are just 400 years ago, King James employed scribes to translate the Bible into English, and it's called the King James Bible. So these countries, even though it was done before the 1800s, but things took place before the curse was lifted, but they were getting ready to be, things were getting ready to be fulfilled to bless these two nations because of the covenant given to the seed of Abraham, which was Ephraim and Manasseh. And when Britain went out and colonized, for instance, in South Africa, had the Suez Canal, Gibraltar was over in Hong Kong, Britain was in India, and when Britain went out into the world, even in that 19th century, it brought the world out of some of the dark ages that the world has been in, the same way that the United States, on this side of the ocean, was brought out of its rule, and you might say dark ages, and into the industrial age. And so in the 20th century, we've had all the industry of the coal and the steel and the mining and our roads and our academic pursuits. So our liberty and our human rights was framed on the Bible, or the common law of England. Also in the scriptures that the sea gates or passes on the land. In other words, I believe it's the Khyber Pass over in northern Afghanistan was controlled by the British at one time. The Suez Canal, the Straits of, I can't remember, the Straits of no, it's not Humas, the Straits next to Singapore. In other words, Singapore and Hong Kong were British outposts of finance and British control. And so wherever Britain went, they brought wealth and prosperity to the nations that they were occupying. These were the colonial nations. So we know that the sun never set on Britain, that Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, Gibraltar, all were Commonwealth of Britain. And so in the United States, we controlled the Suez Canal up until 1999, and can you imagine that the way we depend on shipping and the way that we depend on protection and having control over your own destiny, that we would give away the Panama Canal to someone else to run. Also, the things that happened in the United States, that Fulton invented the steamboat, and here again we had inventors in American ingenuity, which invented some of the things, the internal combustion engine, which I think probably started over in Germany, especially with diesel, because the German man Diesel was the one that made the diesel engine. But in this past century, well, that's getting a little ahead of the story here. So the United States and Great Britain possess some of the choicest land and environment in the whole world. We were also the leaders in gold, silver, iron, and coal, and timber up until about 1960. We also are surrounded by some of the world's largest freshwater lakes. We also have a tremendous amount of rivers and streams. All were freshwater until we polluted them in the last half of the last century. We also, as We know from geography that the British Isles were safely protected by what's now called the English Channel, but they were safely protected from Europe and European wars by that 20-mile divide of the English Channel. The United States has been protected in its entirety by the two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. We've always had good rapport with our southern neighbors up until recently because of some of the NAFTA problems and our energy problems, and also trade in commodity markets. One of the big ones is soybeans with Brazil. Up until the latter part of the 20th century, the United States and Great Britain produced 3/4 of the world's steel output. Canada and the United States had the world's supply of nickel, aluminum, and zinc. And to bring up that point there with the minerals, that two nations now control the mineral deposits of nickel, aluminum, zinc, cadmium, and they are South Africa and Russia. And so in order to have industrial manufacturing, you need chrome, nickel, and zinc for these products. And if you don't have a mine, and what I think happened was that the United States just shut down their mines and bought it from other countries. Great Britain had in the 19th century had the world's largest merchant fleet. And up until, I guess, the latter half of the 20th century, we still had the world's largest merchant fleet. But as we know now that the curses have come upon us and that fleets have depleted and even our military might is depleted. And just recently we understand that our airplanes, our fleet of military airplanes are in decay, meaning they're you might say outdated, but also they're like 25 years old. And of course the stress on the airframes make them not suitable for warfare. And I believe our bomber supply, we used to have several hundred of our B-52s, and now we're down to less than 100. I believe our B-2 bombers, which is the latest version of our military might, is down to 24. And so America and Great Britain had the benefit of the blessings of the covenant given to the Israelite people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we are the recipients of all these things, and we allowed our nation to prosper in the way it is. And we also allowed the freedom of speech. We also allowed the freedom of religion to come in. Lord Balmer of Catholicism came into Balmer. That's how Balmer was named Balmer. 10 miles from me here is the seat of Mother Seton in the Catholicism faith. We also have the Lady of Lourdes, the idol worship system is over there at Emmitsburg. We also have a university and a seminary there. But also we can say that God allowed His truth to come across the ocean too, and so we had Sabbath-keeping peoples, and we've had that turmoil of the splitting of these individual entities down through the centuries. So it'd be well for anyone that's interested in those things to look up what happened to religion and how we got to where we are today and what it means in the coming future. So we have to realize that in Revelation and Daniel it does talk about the establishment of the kingdom here on earth. In Revelation 11 about the coming of the two witnesses, the statements of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, especially Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13, talking about the end of the age and when would these things come to pass. So using the weekly cycle of a year for a day, we're at the end of 6,000 years, just coming up before Jesus Christ returns and the establishment of the coming kingdom of God. And so we understand all these things because, as it says, I said in Corinthians 2:14, that these things are spiritually discerned. And anyone that's interested and really wants to know what happens or why we have what we have today, why we're losing some of our financial security, why we're having our social and internal problems, and why we're hated in the world, even though we have been the most giving the greatest of all the, we even finance, I think, a large part of the United Nations, but I believe it was in the 1920s that Russia went through a famine, and we sent shiploads of wheat over there to stave off the famine in Russia. We've sent shiploads of things, of wheat and food to India, and we still have food, and we still send help to various nations or whatever their problems are. But one of the reasons we're hated in what we have, what the shape we're in today, is because that we are covenant people and we are God's people. And the Gentile nations have always hated the laws of God. Anywhere in the world, the laws of God came up, the Gentile nations and I guess you'd say the idolatrous people or idolatrous worshiping people hated the truth of God's coming kingdom and the establishment of this kingdom. And it's all revealed in God's holy word. And the history of the world is all tied up in the Bible. And so to go forward in this, you need to look up the different things that interest you, in whether it be the tribes of Israel or what happened to England or what happened to the United States, and also the things that are yet to come in the future to this beloved nation that God has now withdrawn some of the blessings that He gave us. And so we're looking forward to the establishment of the millennial kingdom.